Going into cs5, I'm now going to show you some new features and work on two images where the capture isn't quite ideal in terms of exposure. First of all, I need to stretch out the interface a little bit. It's a bit cramped here. So I'm just pulling the whole box up and pulling it from the bottom and stretching it out like this. Now it's obviously underexposed, and I've worked on it a little bit before, so I pretty much know what the initial starting point is going to have to be. I'm just going to first do exactly the same as I did previously, and bear in mind also that I've taken the tone curve off, so you now have a linear curve there. Okay, I'm now going to press the Option Alt key and see if we can get a bit more light into this image. Now the screen has gone black because I'm holding down the Alt key for the clipping display, and at about 3 plus 3 we get the highlights in there, and that's too much. So if we backtrack, say, to 2, I can just type in 2 here. So when we've actually put in +2 here, that means we've actually compensated 2 stops. So the image should really have been shot 2 stops lighter than it is. You can go very far in Camera Raw in correcting an exposure like this, especially when it's shot as a RAW file in the first place. If it was a JPEG, you wouldn't have a chance of getting any good quality out of it. Now, because this is one of a series, I've actually got a preset that I've made for this. Now what I'm going to do is load the preset here that I made earlier. That's basically the white balance, and if I go back to the basic tab there, I ended up with an exposure of 1.85. I was dithering a little bit on whether to take the blacks down to 4. The blacks default to 5. If I just type in 4 there, you'll see quite a difference. I think that's a bit too milky, so I'm going to take that back to 5. Just going to the presets again, I've only got one preset so far in cs5, but it's very good if you're doing a series to have a preset, a starting point perhaps to create some variations from. If you do use the preset, then load it straight away and carry on working from there, because if you load it, you override everything else that you've done. And by the way, this is not a cs5 feature. What is a new feature is the snapshots. I've actually also created a snapshot here that we can go back to, and I'm going to try and remember to make a snapshot later on as well. I'm going to bypass the tone curve and go straight into the HSL. Now if I put any contrast on here, the colours will just become more vivid, and I didn't really want that to happen. So I'm going to take the luminance of the oranges slightly up, brightening up the skin where it's the most orange a few points, using the down key on my keyboard. Probably just about +5 is fine. Also I want to take the saturation down of the orange a little bit. So here I'm going the opposite way. So I end up here at about -10. That should be fine. I might just put in a little bit of saturation on the reds, just giving the image back a little bit of its life there. Our job here is really just to capture what's in the image, get rid of the worst of the saturation in the skin, and contain the colour that's in the image in general. In cs5 we now have a new feature, which is noise reduction. It sits here along with a sharpening. Although there is some sharpening in here, there's no sharpening being put on the image because I've disabled it in the preferences. So I'm going to go straight to noise reduction, and here we have some hair that is looking very noisy. Let's zoom in, and I hope you can see the noise here in general. Let's start with luminance. Now I'm just going to pull this up to, I'd say, about 40. And you see it gets a little bit blurry there. So I'm going to take it now to a level of about 30. It does soften the hair just a bit too much. So I'm going to pull up the luminance detail and see if we can just bring back some of the detail in there. And I think they're approaching about 70, that we have enough detail there. Let's also put a little bit of luminance contrast on there, separating the hairs a bit more. We can also use the P key to toggle the before and after, and if you see there, that's before we put any noise reduction on, and this is the noise reduction. That's looking pretty good, but I'm just going to chance it and see if I can bring it up a little bit more on the color, just getting rid of all that noise. 40, maybe a bit too much, but let's see if we bring the color detail up again to about the 70s there, and preview, off and back on. Now so far I've been looking mostly at the hair. Now I'm going to preview again, just looking at the face a bit more, going a little further up there so I can see the eyes. That's off and back on. Well, considering that this is a non-sharpened image, which will be sharpened later, I think we can just about get away with this. But the only thing I'm seeing here is that she's getting a little bit too noiseless everywhere else, and obviously this isn't something you can apply locally unless you of course process it twice, which you could do. But what I'd like to do is put in a little bit of the new grain, which I quite like. Before I put any grain on it, I might as well just make myself a snapshot. So I'm just going into the snapshot tab and making a new snapshot there at the bottom, and I'm going to put no grain. Now you'll find the grain on the FX tab, which is where you also find the post-crop vignetting. Okay, I'm going to start now with just putting up an amount of grain, a bit too much, just to about 50. And I've got to judge the size of the grain and the roughness. Now I do like the grain to be quite small and fine, but I also like it to be quite rough, and by that I really just mean irregular. Now it's looking awful now, but that's because I've got too much size and too much amount. So I'm going to start taking my size down to probably quite close to 10, and if I then take the amount down, and I'm getting closer, but I still got too much. I think the size needs to go just down a touch, probably to about 10. I like round numbers. Going a bit more down there, can also use the keyboard keys there. Now that's given that image a little bit more of a hold, a bit more film-like really. So you may ask yourself, what's the point of taking the noise off and putting grain on? Well, let's look at the difference. We can now go into the snapshots and make ourselves a new snapshot, grain, and let's compare it. No grain is this one. We can also look at the start where we actually had the noise in the first place. If we now compare that with the grain, look at the hair, look at the face, and look at the difference. We now have much less noise in the hair and a little bit more grain in the face. So the grain is really holding together the image, where the noise in the first place here was actually breaking it apart a little bit. It was making the hair look very different from the face, and the reason for that is that that was the darkest part of the image, and it's in the darks that you tend to get the excessive noise when you underexpose. So that's one reason to not underexpose. Going back to my grain, this is a bit like moving around in the history, these snapshots. Now let's press Command 0, taking the crop tool, dragging a crop all around here, maybe just pulling it up a little bit there. And I'm now going to go to the post-crop vignetting, which has moved. It was previously on the lens tab. I'm going to first put the amount up, right up. What I'm going to do is put a little bit of flare in, but not as obvious a vignette as this one. We can work with color priority, highlight priority, or paint overlay. And what I don't want is these bright corners here. I'm going to go perhaps even a little bit further in. I can also feather it a little bit more. I can maybe zoom in and zoom in again. Now I've got too much going on there. I'm going to adjust my midpoint back so it's not quite as extreme, and also then take the amount down. Let's have a look at the whole image and use the key, the P, to look at the before and after. And in fact, I think this works quite well. It also does the job of lightening up the hair a little bit and the edges at the bottom here. So the new thing here really is that you have a few more controls here on the post-crop vignetting. So this is an image now that is ready to retouch, and also it isn't going to need a lot of colour correction. You're just going to need to lighten a little bit here on the neck. Okay, so we are in our very overexposed image, and that's clear for all to see, but looking at the histogram here, we need to know how much to take it down and rescue the highlights here. This is something that Adobe Camera Raw is very good at. Let me press down the Option Alt key and just pull that towards the left, and you see that we are rescuing highlights here as we go along. Now I'm going to go about this far, and I know that I won't be able to rescue the highlights here. They're just too strong. So I'm going to have to come back to this image in Photoshop and actually use a minimum dot or comp in a sky or another exposure here. Part of the problem with the image is also that it's very flat, so I'm going to try and bring out a little bit more contrast in it. And the first thing we need to do there is use the blacks, and you can see there we've got a gap in the blacks there. So in other words, there are no blacks. Holding down the Option Alt key, we're going to locate some blacks. Now what's emerging here is some cyany blues at the bottom. I'm going to go a little bit further. So looking at that, I might just backtrack a little bit using the down key on my keyboard to about 12 there. Now I'm going to throw everything at this image just to make it a bit more interesting. I'm going to take the contrast up in a very simple way, just using that contrast slider there, which is biased towards the midtones. I'm even going to put a bit of clarity on it, just to give it a bit more of a 3D feel, seemingly sharper. I'm even going to give it a little bit of vibrance, just to bring out those colours in the flags. I haven't yet done anything on the white balance. I'm just going to take the white balancing tool and click around a little bit, because there are lots of contenders here for white balance. Now normally I don't click on a super white. If I click on a white there, it's just going to give me a message or a no sign that you can't use it. The areas you're trying to click on are too bright, so okay there. I could click in, for example, her hair there. That's not bad actually. The building, the ground. Although it's a white balance tool, it doesn't have to be white. It just needs to be something that you perceive as neutral. In fact, I am going to go on the hair and see if I can fix those colours a little bit, that warmness there afterwards. Moving on to my tone curve there, I'm going to go to linear, and I'm just going to command click on her hair. I'm going to let that go a little bit brighter. I'm just using the up key there. I'm also going to command click on one of these windows here, a darker area, and just bring that down. Now we've got to remember that this was overexposed in the first place, so we can deepen it, but we don't really want to go much below the cross line here. I really don't want to make it too dark in the shadows. I can maybe just bring the deepest shadows slightly more down. P for preview, and that's brought a little bit more light and a bit more contrast into it. Going to the HSL grayscale, I'm looking for the colour in that building there. I think it's probably reds or oranges. Let me just try now on the oranges and saturate that completely to see what comes through. And yes, there is a lot of orange happening here. Now I was going to take the oranges down, but I think maybe it could benefit from a little bit of this colour being thrown into it. So I might just keep that and actually desaturate some of this building afterwards. I'm also going to just saturate the reds a little bit more selectively. They're quite deep, these reds, and I think they will hold their own and print quite well. Finally, I think the image needs some balancing up, so I'm just going to go to the graduated filter there. Now I'm going to drag a gradation up here. I'm going to take the brightness a little bit down, take the exposure back a bit there. As you do remember, we started out with an overexposed image. I don't want it really as light as it was in the first place. but this is working quite well for me. I'm also going to put the contrast up a little bit on this. I'm going to add another one, a new one there, just dragging it in there. On this one I am going to take the exposure down a bit and change the colour of it slightly to a slightly warmer colour there. Now let's go back to our normal tab. Just by pressing H I can get out of this and into the basic there. And let's have a look at a preview of this image. That's before and that's after. Now, the only thing I'm seeing there is I probably think it should be a slightly cooler image, and I mean that in terms of the temperature and the tint. So I'm going to just drag that a tiny bit towards the blue and also a touch towards the green there, giving it that window glass kind of look there to it, and previewing that again and back on there again. You still have this one spike of very bright highlight here, but this is at least an acceptable image, and I think we've made quite a good version of it here.